Didn't cry. I didn't chase after anyone. I just stood in my own driveway, holding my daughter's hand, and watched the door of my brother's house close in my face. That was the moment I stopped being the family's safety net. Let me back up. My name is Onwen. I'm 32. I work as a senior project coordinator at a mid-sized construction firm in Ottawa, and before any of this happened, I would have described myself as someone who kept the family together. My mom passed when I was 26, ovarian cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to gone, and after that, I became the one who showed up, the one who answered the phone at midnight, the one who remembered birthdays and checked in when things got quiet. I have a daughter, Zoe, who is 7. Her father and I separated when she was 2. It wasn't dramatic. It just didn't work, and we both knew it. He's a decent dad. We split time well, and I've built a life I'm genuinely proud of. I own a small townhouse in Kanata. I have a stable income, a good RRSP, and a savings account I built carefully over 5 years, $38,000 that I never touched because I wanted to eventually move somewhere with a backyard for Zoe. That money was real. It meant something. It was built out of packed lunches and skipped vacations, and every time I said no to something I wanted so that the future could feel more solid. My brother's name is Callum. He's 38. He has a wife, Renata, and they've been together for 12 years. Callum is smart and charming and has always had a way of making you feel like you're the one person in the world who truly understands him. Growing up, that quality made him magnetic. As an adult, I've come to understand it differently. Callum has a way of making his problems feel like your problems, gently, without ever saying it outright. He'd just describe a situation until you felt the pull to fix it, and somehow you'd end up volunteering before you'd even decided to. He called me on a Thursday evening in February about 18 months ago. Zoe was doing homework at the kitchen table and I was making pasta. He said he and Renata had found the property, the one, a restaurant space in Westboro, a neighborhood in Ottawa that was already saturated with good food and young professionals with money to spend on it. He'd been talking about opening a restaurant for years. Since he was 25, honestly. He'd worked in kitchens, done a culinary program in Montreal, staged at a couple of places that mattered. He had real skill. That part was never in question. The space needed work. Not demolition-level work, but a serious renovation, new flooring, a commercial kitchen build-out, front-of-house design permits, equipment. His contractor gave him a number. He had financing lined up through BDC, the Business Development Bank, but there was a gap. He needed $40,000 to bridge it, and he needed it within 6 weeks, or he'd lose the lease. He didn't ask directly. That was never how Callum worked. He talked about the opportunity for almost 20 minutes, and somewhere in the middle of it, I asked how much he was short. He said $40,000, and then there was a pause, just long enough before he said, "I know it's a lot." I'd never ask if there wasn't a path to paying it back. I told him I had to think about it. I did think about it. I made a spreadsheet. I looked at my savings and my timeline and what it would mean to start over from zero on the house fund. I talked to my financial advisor, who was professional enough not to say, "Absolutely do not do this," but who asked several careful questions about the repayment plan and what documentation I'd have. I talked to a friend of mine who'd done a business loan before. I didn't talk to my dad because my dad has always thought Callum walked on water, and I knew what he'd say. What I kept coming back to was this. Callum was 45 days away from opening something he'd spent 15 years building toward. I had the money, and we were family. I called him back on a Sunday. I said yes. We sat down in person the following weekend, Callum, Renata, and me at their dining room table. I brought a typed repayment agreement that I drafted with the help of a template from a Canadian legal resource site. It wasn't drawn up by a lawyer, but it laid out the terms clearly. $40,000, interest-free, to be repaid in monthly installments beginning 6 months after the restaurant opened. Callum signed it without argument. Renata signed as a witness. I transferred the money from my savings account the next morning. $38,000 from savings, $2,000 from my checking, every dollar I had set aside. The restaurant opened in October. It was called Ardor. The space looked beautiful, warm light, exposed brick, a small open kitchen behind a counter of pale wood. I went to the soft launch with Zoe. We sat at a corner table and ate duck confit and roasted beets and a chocolate tart that Zoe declared the best thing she'd ever tasted. Callum came out of the kitchen in his apron and hugged me, and he said quietly, next to my ear, "I couldn't have done this without you." I believed him. I was proud of him. I thought the hard part was over. The first repayment was due in April. It didn't come. I waited 2 weeks, then texted Callum. He said they'd had a slow month and could he push it by 30 days. I said fine. May's payment didn't come either. He called and said the spring had been rough, that a review they'd been counting on hadn't materialized, that they were restructuring their weekend menu to bring in more traffic. I listened. I said okay. I transferred $20 to my savings account that night, symbolically, because I needed to feel like I was doing something. By July, nothing had been repaid, not $1. I asked for a meeting, in person. Callum agreed, and we met at a coffee shop on Elgin Street on a Tuesday morning. I brought the signed agreement. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at me and said that things were harder than he'd expected and that he needed more time. I asked for a timeline. He gave me something vague about Q4 and hoping the holiday season would help. I asked if he'd considered a small business loan to cover his operational shortfalls instead of continuing to defer repayment to me. He got quiet. Renata, who he'd brought without telling me, leaned in and said that I knew how hard this industry was, that restaurants almost always lost money in the first year, and that pressuring Callum right now wasn't helpful. I sat with that for a second. I said, very calmly, that I wasn't pressuring anyone. I was asking about a repayment agreement that both of them had signed. Renata looked at me the way you look at someone who just said something embarrassing in public. I drove home thinking about the $38,000. About the backyard I no longer had a timeline for. About Zoe asking me that past summer why we weren't going to Nova Scotia like I'd mentioned, and me saying we'd go next year. The thing about being the person who holds the family together is that you start to notice, eventually, when the weight is only flowing one direction. November arrived. Still nothing. I sent a formal written notice to Callum's email, the terms of the agreement, the amount outstanding, and a request for a repayment schedule by the end of the month. He didn't respond to the email. He texted me 4 days later to say he'd seen it and that I was making things weird. I sat with that word for a while, too. My dad called me the second week of November. Someone had told him, Callum, presumably, that I'd sent a formal notice. My dad is 71, still sharp, still opinionated, and he has never once in his life voluntarily been uncomfortable on Callum's behalf. He said he thought I was being rigid. He said that family didn't send formal documents to each other. He said that Callum was under enormous pressure and that what he needed from me was patience, not paperwork. I asked my dad if he knew how much money I'd lent. He said yes, he knew it was $40,000 and that it would come back to me. I asked him if he knew that the original savings had been my entire house fund. He went quiet for a moment and then said that I had a good job and I could rebuild it, and that Callum only got one chance to make this dream work. I said, Dad, what about Zoe's backyard? He said, Anwen, don't make this about Zoe. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. What happened next wasn't something I planned. It started with a phone call from my accountant in early December when I was reviewing my year-end finances. She flagged the outstanding loan and asked if I had any documentation. I said I had a signed agreement. She said that if I wanted to pursue it formally, I had options. Small Claims Court in Ontario handles disputes up to $35,000, and for amounts above that, I'd be looking at Superior Court. She said it plainly, without drama, the way accountants do. I hung up and sat in my car in the parking garage under my office building for about 10 minutes. I didn't want to sue my brother. I want to be clear about that. What I wanted was for my brother to pick up the phone and say, here is what I owe you, here is how I'm going to pay it back. I'm sorry it's taken this long. That was all. That was the only thing that would have made any of this stop. But he hadn't done that. For 8 months, he hadn't done that. So I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Ossie, and she had an office on Bank Street in a no-nonsense manner that I found immediately reassuring. She reviewed the agreement and said it was enforceable. Not perfect. It would have been stronger with independent legal witnesses and a notarized signature. But the signatures were there, the terms were clear, and the e-transfer records from my bank confirmed the amount and the date. She said if it went to court, I had a reasonable case. She also said something that stuck with me. Before you file anything, send a formal demand letter. Sometimes that's enough. We sent the demand letter on December 15th, registered mail to Callum's home address. It outlined the full outstanding balance, $40,000, and requested repayment in full within 30 days, or a signed repayment plan within 14. It noted that failure to respond would result in legal proceedings. Callum called me 40 minutes after he received it. He was not calm. He said I had humiliated him in front of Renata. He said I had gone behind his back to a lawyer instead of talking to him like an adult. He said that this was exactly the kind of thing that destroys families and that he couldn't believe I was doing this to him after everything. I let him finish. I asked if he'd read the letter. He said he didn't need to read it. He'd seen enough. I said, Callum, the letter is asking for the money you signed an agreement to repay. That's it. That's all this is. He told me not to come to Christmas. I want to tell you something about that moment. I was standing in my kitchen, leaning against the counter, and Zoe was upstairs doing a puzzle. It was a Wednesday evening, and it was dark outside, and there was snow coming down past the window. When Callum said, "Don't come to Christmas," and Christmas at my dad's house had been the one fixed thing in our family calendar since my mom died, something in me went very still. Not hurt, exactly, more like a door closing, quietly. I said, "Okay," and I hung up. My dad called an hour later. He'd heard from Callum. He told me I needed to withdraw the letter and apologize. I told him I wasn't going to do either of those things. He said if I didn't, I wouldn't be welcome at the house on the 25th. I told him I understood. My dad and Callum spent Christmas together. I spent it with Zoe at my friend Teresa's place in Barhaven. Teresa's family is loud and warm, and her mother pressed food on everyone with a generosity that felt almost aggressive. Zoe had a genuinely wonderful time. She didn't know what she was missing because I didn't tell her. I knew what I was missing. I knew exactly. January came. No repayment. No counterproposal. No response of any kind to the demand letter within the deadline. I called Patricia. She filed the claim. What I didn't know yet, what I found out 3 weeks into January from my cousin Bex, who'd heard it through my aunt, was that Callum and Renata had been quietly reaching out to family members. Not just my dad, my aunt, my uncle, a couple of cousins, telling them in various ways that I had gone legal on Callum and was trying to destroy his business right when it was starting to gain traction. Callum had apparently told at least 2 people that I was acting out of jealousy because his restaurant was doing well and my life hadn't turned out the way I'd planned. That particular detail, the jealousy angle, was the one that got under my skin. Bex is my favorite cousin. She's 40. She has no patience for nonsense, and she called me directly to tell me what she'd heard because she wanted me to know before I walked into any family situation blind. She also said, without me asking, "For the record, I told your uncle that you lent him $40,000 and he hasn't paid back a cent," and your uncle went quiet for about 10 seconds and then changed the subject. I thanked her. I meant it. The legal process moved slowly, the way these things do, but it moved, and in the meantime, something shifted in me that I hadn't quite expected. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I stopped trying to figure out how to make my brother understand something he clearly didn't want to understand. I started putting $200 a month back into my savings, slowly, but something was better than zero. I also did something that I've been putting off for 2 years. I sat down with Zoe properly and we talked about what she wanted in a home. She said she wanted a place where she could have a cat. She said she wanted a yard, even a small one, because she liked the idea of growing tomatoes like Teresa's mom did. She said she wanted a room big enough for a reading nook. I wrote it all down. I put it on my fridge. That list mattered more to me than I can explain. The court date was set for late April. Civil procedure in Ontario is not fast, but our situation was relatively straightforward. Written agreement, clear amount, documented transfer, no repayment. Patricia said she was cautiously optimistic. I said I just wanted it to be over. What happened before the court date, though, was something I hadn't anticipated. 10 days before we were scheduled to appear, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Gregory Holt. He said he was Renata's father. I had met Gregory twice, once at Callum and Renata's wedding 7 years ago, briefly, and once at a family dinner 2 Easters before everything fell apart. He was a quiet man, I remembered, a retired civil engineer from Kingston, not someone who inserted himself into things. He said he'd found out about the situation in full, the loan, the agreement, the non-payment, the legal claim, and that he wanted to speak with me directly. I was cautious. I didn't know what angle he was coming from. He said, "I want to be straightforward with you. What Callum and Renata did was wrong. You had a legal agreement. You were patient for 8 months. You followed the correct process. And from what I've been able to piece together, the restaurant has been turning a profit since September." I went still. He said it again, more quietly. Since September. Not a windfall, not getting rich, but in the black. Callum had known when he told me Q4 might be hopeful that Q3 had already turned around. Gregory said he'd spoken to Renata about it at length and that he was not satisfied with her answers. He said he'd looked at the restaurant's incorporation documents, he'd helped them structure the business initially, and that there was a mechanism that would allow a lump sum payment to be made from business reserves without disrupting operations. He said he'd told Renata that if she and Callum didn't resolve this before the court date, he would not continue to support the business in any capacity, including the ongoing operational advice he'd been providing and a small line of credit he'd personally guaranteed for their equipment lease. He wasn't doing this for me. He was doing it because he believed in following through on what you sign. I thanked him. I meant that too. 4 days before the court date, Callum's lawyer contacted Patricia. They proposed a settlement, full repayment of the $40,000 within 60 days, plus $2,000 in legal costs. Patricia called me to relay the offer. She said it was a clean resolution and that she'd recommend taking it if my goal was recovery of the funds rather than a judgment on record. I took it. The money came through in 2 transfers, 30 days apart. The second one arrived on a Tuesday in June. I sat with my phone in my hand for a moment after the notification came through, looking at the number in my account. $42,000 that had been gone for a year and a half. Back. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I'm not sure what I felt. Something closer to exhale. Like I'd been holding my breath for so long that I'd stopped noticing. Callum has not called me since the settlement was finalized. My dad called once, briefly, to say that he hoped I was satisfied. I told him I was. He didn't say anything after that. We haven't spoken since, though I've sent Zoe to his house twice for her scheduled visits, and I'm told he's warm with her, which I'm grateful for. Zoe doesn't need to carry any of this. She just needs her grandfather to show up, and he does. Renata sent me a text 3 weeks after everything was concluded. It said, "I know things went the way they went. I hope Zoe is well." I read it several times. I didn't respond. Bex and I have dinner every few weeks now. That's new, and I'm glad for it. The townhouse I bought is in Stittsville. It's 20 minutes outside the city, close enough to Zoe's school that the commute is manageable. There's a small backyard, not large, but real. A concrete patio with room for a table, and beyond that, a strip of grass that gets good afternoon sun. Last weekend, Zoe and I went to a garden center on Eagleson Road and bought 2 tomato plants, a pot of basil, and a small terracotta planter for the patio. She carried the basil to the car herself, very carefully, holding it with both hands. We also, after approximately 11 months of discussion, got a cat. His name is Biscuit. He is enormous, gray, and profoundly unimpressed with everything. Zoe is completely devoted to him. My savings account is rebuilding. It will take time. That's okay. I know how to build things slowly. I've been doing it my whole life. What I think about now, when I think about all of it, is not the money, or not only the money. It's the moment when my dad told me not to make it about Zoe. That's the sentence that stays with me. Because the whole reason I had that savings account in the first place was Zoe. The backyard was for Zoe. The stability, the careful planning, the pasta dinners instead of restaurants, all of it was oriented toward giving her something solid to stand on. And when I said her name out loud in that context, the response was, "Don't." I understand now that I was allowed to make it about Zoe. I was always allowed to. The people who love you don't ask you to set down the thing that matters most in order to make room for their comfort. That's not love, that's just leverage dressed up in familiar language. Zoe asked me last week out of nowhere while we were making dinner whether I thought things always worked out in the end. I was cutting carrots and I had to think about it for a real minute before I answered. I said, not always, but the things you protect, the things you fight for with the right tools, the right words, the right people beside you, those things have a better chance. She thought about that. Then she asked if Biscuit counted as one of the right people. I said yes, obviously. She went back to setting the table and I finished the carrots, and through the kitchen window I could see the tomato plants on the patio, small and green and just starting to climb. The tomato plants on the patio are about 8 inches tall now. That's what I keep coming back to, somehow. Not the bank notification, not the court filing, not even the moment Patricia told me the settlement had been accepted. Just those 2 small plants that Zoe carried to the car with both hands, careful as anything, like she already understood they were worth protecting. I've been thinking about what it actually takes to get from the moment you transfer $40,000 in good faith to the moment you get it back. People see the ending, the lawyer, the demand letter, the settlement, and they think the hard part was the fight. It wasn't. The hard part was the long stretch of months before that when I kept finding reasons to wait 1 more week, 1 more call, 1 more reasonable extension. I think a lot of us are trained to believe that patience and loyalty look the same thing. They don't. Patience is something you choose. What I was doing for most of that year was something closer to hoping that if I made myself small enough and quiet enough, the discomfort would resolve itself without me having to cause any. It didn't resolve itself. It never does. What finally moved me wasn't anger. I want to be honest about that because I think there's a version of this story where the narrator snaps, goes cold, becomes someone harder. That didn't happen to me. What moved me was sitting with my accountant on an ordinary Tuesday, hearing the word options used plainly and without drama, and realizing that I had been so focused on managing everyone else's feelings that I had stopped thinking clearly about my own situation. That's what I mean when I say intelligence isn't just about being smart. It's about being honest with yourself when the facts are right in front of you and you've been choosing not to look directly at them. I had a signed agreement. I had documentation. I had a legitimate claim. I'd been treating those facts like they were somehow rude to mention. The thing about Callum calling it jealousy, about reframing my legal request as some personal failing of mine, is that it was designed to make me doubt my own reading of events. And for a little while, in those first days after the demand letter went out, it worked. I sat with that word and I turned it over. Was I jealous? Was this about something else? I did the uncomfortable work of actually examining that because I think you owe it to yourself to be honest even when it's inconvenient. And what I found, when I was straight with myself, was no. I wasn't jealous of a restaurant. I was owed $40,000 that I'd built over 5 years of packed lunches and skipped vacations, and the person who owed it to me had decided that my patience was the same thing as permission to never pay it back. That's not jealousy, that's a boundary, and recognizing the difference, having the clarity to name it, and then the steadiness to act on it even when everyone around you is telling you you're making things weird, that's something you have to build in yourself over time. It doesn't arrive fully formed. I didn't feel certain when I called Patricia. I didn't feel certain when I signed the court papers. I felt scared and sad, and I did it anyway because Zoe's name was on that fridge list, and I was not going to explain to her in 3 years why her backyard didn't exist. Gregory Holt didn't have to call me. He didn't owe me anything. But he looked at what was true and he acted on it, and I think about that often, the quiet decency of someone who had no stake in the outcome except that the right thing should happen. That kind of integrity doesn't announce itself. It just shows up when it's needed and does what it came to do. Zoe asked Biscuit last night if he thought things would keep getting better. He stared at her with the full weight of his indifference and then walked away. She seemed to take this as confirmation. I'm inclined to agree with him.